Three things happened when Private Mara Chin stepped off the bus at Fort Bragg on a gray Tuesday morning in October. First, she tripped on the bottom step. It was a small trip, barely a stumble, corrected almost before it fully registered. But the timing was perfect in the worst possible way, because the man standing at the base of the bus steps had been watching for exactly this kind of thing, and he had been watching in the precise manner of a predator that has been waiting in the same spot for a long time, and has learned patience through the reliable repetition of its own success. Second, Staff Sergeant Wade Hartman smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed a gift he expected, confirmation of a worldview he had been constructing for 38 years, that the world was divided into those who belonged in hard places and those who didn't, and the ones who didn't could usually be identified within the first 30 seconds. Third, every other recruit on that bus, 19 men ranging from former college athletes to ex-Marines attempting lateral entry into Army Special Operations, filed down the steps behind her and instinctively, without communication or coordination, took a half-step back. Not away from her, away from what was coming. They were right. Hartman descended on her the way bad weather descends, with a sense that it had been building a long time. Private Chun. He read the name off her orders with the flat effect of a man reading a grocery receipt, something to be checked and discarded. Then he looked up. His eyes were the gray of old concrete, the kind of gray that has absorbed 30 years of people's worst days and reflects nothing back. 5'2", 115 pounds. He let the numbers hang in the October air for a moment. Someone at admin made a mistake, he said. You're in the wrong line. Ranger Assessment and Selection Program, Sergeant. Her voice was quiet. Not the quietness of intimidation, not smaller than she already appeared, but quiet the way a very deep lake is quiet at the surface, a stillness that reveals nothing about what's below. I'm in the right line. Hartman leaned down. He was 6'3" and had been in the business of breaking people for 15 years, and he put his face approximately 8 inches from hers, close enough that she could catalog every dietary decision he'd made in the last 24 hours if she chose to. You, he said, very softly, in the voice he used when he wanted to make clear that what came next was personal, are going to be my little project. Marachan looked at him. She did not blink more frequently than biology required. She did not step back. Not even the micro-retreat of a half-inch that most people perform involuntarily when someone violates their personal space. She said nothing at all. Behind her, Recruit Morrison, 23 years old, former Division I linebacker for a program that had gone to 3 consecutive bowl games, the kind of man who could probably bench press Hartman's entire philosophy, felt something contract in his chest that he didn't have a word for yet. He would have one later. He'd call it foreboding. Not for her. For Hartman. He just didn't know why yet. None of them did. The Pentagon, however, knew exactly what it was watching. The Ranger Assessment and Selection Program is not designed to be comfortable. This is by design and by necessity. The 75th Ranger Regiment needs soldiers who can function when everything is wrong simultaneously, when they are exhausted, wet, cold, hungry, disoriented, and being shot at, and when the person to their left has just made a mistake that may kill them both. The selection course exists to find who will keep functioning in those conditions, and to find this out before it costs lives in a place where the only medevac is 30 minutes away and might not come at all. Hartman had been running RASP for 4 years, and his philosophy could be expressed with a simple mechanical metaphor. Find the weakest link, break it publicly, and every other link will work harder to avoid being next. It was not a sophisticated philosophy. It was not a compassionate one, but it produced numbers. And in institutions of sufficient scale, numbers often substitute for thought. What the numbers did not capture, what the handful of suppressed complaints and quietly transferred candidates and one death that had been officially ruled something other than what it was could not be easily quantified, was the cost. The method worked, but it worked the way certain chemical processes work, efficiently, and with byproducts that were difficult to dispose of safely. Hartman saw Mara Chun and saw the easiest, weakest link he had ever been handed in 4 years. He was not incorrect that she was small. He was not incorrect that she was the only woman among 20 candidates, that she had arrived with a service record thin enough to read in under a minute, that she stood in the barracks bay that first evening unpacking her kit with the unhurried calm of someone who had either done this many times before or had no idea what was coming. He cataloged all of these observations and filed them under confirmed. What he was wrong about was the interpretation. The first morning was the standard physical fitness evaluation, a 5-mile run, followed by maximum repetition push-ups and pull-ups, a water confidence assessment, and a land navigation exercise designed to be completed by candidates who were already physically depleted and psychologically rattled. Hartman's strategy for Mara was transparent in its intent. He placed her at the front of the run formation, where her performance would be maximally visible to the other candidates, and where her inevitable collapse, her falling behind, her gasping for air, her proving his point for him, would be a public lesson in institutional selection. She ran the 5 miles in 27 minutes and 32 seconds. For reference, the Ranger standard for a 5-mile run is 40 minutes. The program record, set the previous year by a candidate who had been a Division I track athlete and later described the run as one of the hardest physical efforts of his life, was 29 minutes 11 seconds. She didn't look like she was trying. Her form was economical to the point of being almost clinical. No wasted motion, no bounce in the stride, no expenditure of energy that did not directly translate into forward progress. Her breathing ran in a controlled 4-4 pattern, 4 steps in, 4 steps out, for the entirety of the run, never breaking, never accelerating into the ragged chaos that indicates a body approaching its limits. Her face was the same at mile 5 as it had been at mile 1. Focused, neutral, present. She also, in a decision so subtle that it would only become apparent much later, allowed Morrison to cross the finish line in second place 41 seconds behind her, by drifting her pace in the final quarter mile in a way that was invisible to every observer except Torres, who had been watching her the entire time. Hartman looked at the stopwatch. He looked at Mara. He looked at the stopwatch again. Day 1 adrenaline, he said to Torres, who was standing beside him with her own stopwatch and an expression that revealed nothing. She'll be a different story by day 3. Torres said, "Yes, Sergeant," and wrote nothing in response to that, and said nothing further. She had learned, in 4 years of working alongside Hartman, that the consequences of saying things she believed to be true arrived reliably, and were not worth the brief satisfaction. But she had been writing, in a personal journal locked in her quarters, from the first morning. The entries were dated and timed and precise in the way that Torres, who had 17 years of Army administrative experience, understood precision to be necessary. Her entry for that first evening was brief, 5-mile time, 27:32. Deliberate pace reduction in final 400 m, controlled deceleration, not fatigue. She's hiding the ceiling. Estimate ceiling is much higher than visible. By day 3, Hartman had built his approach to Mara into something systematic. He rotated her into extra cleaning details, the menial end-of-day work that ate into the brief recovery time between evolutions, while signing off other candidates' barracks areas with standards he did not apply to hers. He stopped her uniform inspections with a precision he reserved exclusively for her, finding fault with things that were technically correct, citing regulations in ways that were technically accurate and contextually dishonest. He positioned her at the front of every physical evolution, and when she performed at the front without difficulty, he repositioned the standard, added weight to her kit, subtracted minutes from her completion window, inserted complications mid-exercise that were not in the published course design and that applied exclusively to her. None of this was illegal, technically. All of it was documented. The commentary ran alongside the structural disadvantaging like a second track. Private Chun, tell me you've actually done push-ups before today, because what you're doing doesn't qualify. Private Chun, my daughter's soccer team runs faster than you. My daughter's soccer team. She's 11. Private Chun, what exactly is your plan here? What do you think you're going to do when there's a real mission and a real enemy, and you weigh 115 pounds? Apologize. The commentary stayed in a particular register, contemptuous, belittling, never quite crossing the specific lines that produced incident reports, always careful enough that deniability remained theoretically available. Hartman had done this for a long time. He knew where the edges were. What he didn't know was that his words were being filed. Not on paper. Not on any device that a routine equipment inspection could locate. Mara was documenting it the way she'd been trained to document field intelligence. Internally, in a mental database organized by time and date, an exact verbatim language, and the names of every witness in eyeshot and earshot. She had been trained in this skill by people who documented intelligence in places where having paper was a death sentence, and she was good at it in the way that she was good at most things that required patience and precision and the willingness to endure discomfort without letting it show. She was also, during this same period, making herself useful in ways that drew no attention. Park was struggling with land navigation. His physical performance was in the top quartile. He ran well, climbed well, pressed well, had a natural athletic economy that Hartman would have praised effusively if Park had been someone else, but he had no instinctive relationship with terrain. He could read a map in still conditions at a table. He could not translate it quickly into three-dimensional space under time pressure and darkness. This gap, if left unaddressed, would wash him out in week 2. On the third evening, in the 20 minutes between dinner and lights out, while Hartman was elsewhere and Torres was writing in her journal, Mara sat down beside Park with his topographic map and spent 20 minutes walking him through a pattern recognition approach to terrain reading that bypassed compass mathematics entirely, a visual shortcut that she had developed herself during a period she could not describe, for purposes she could not specify, in a location that remained classified. Park's navigation times dropped by 4 minutes in the following day's exercise. Morrison noticed. He was paying attention in the way that certain people pay attention when they sense they're in the presence of something they don't yet have a framework for. He had been watching Mara with increasing concentration for several days, watching the gap between how she was being treated and how she was performing, watching the precision behind the apparent vulnerability, watching the way she moved through space like someone who had been occupying difficult spaces for a long time. "Hey," he said to her on the 4th evening. "Where did you train before this?" She looked at him. The warm smile arrived, genuine, reaching her eyes, the expression of someone who actually likes people and is occasionally surprised to find this fact still true. "Around," she said. "Around. Around." Morrison nodded slowly. He had played sports at a high level long enough to recognize when someone was giving him a non-answer because the real answer was complicated, rather than because they had something to hide. The distinction was subtle but real. He didn't push. But he didn't stop watching either. On day 7, during a close-quarters battle exercise, something happened that Hartman would spend the following 2 weeks trying to fit into a framework that could accommodate it, and failing. The exercise was a simulated building clearance, a standard MOUT drill run against role-player opposition forces who were experienced enough to make the candidates work for every room. The format was team-based. 4-person elements entered sequentially, and each team's performance was timed and evaluated for technique, communication, and tactical decision-making. Mara was assigned to a team with Morrison, Park, and a candidate named Diaz. Hartman had made the assignment himself, calculating that the combination of her small frame and the close, violent, fast-moving geometry of building clearance would finally produce the visible failure he had been awaiting. He took the observation position in the monitoring booth above the kill house. One-way glass, direct radio link to the evaluators inside, stopwatch in hand. The team entered at 0843. The team completed the course at 0854. 11 minutes, 8 seconds. The previous course record was 13 minutes, 22 seconds. 0 simulated casualties. All 5 designated threat targets neutralized. Communication throughout was assessed by the interior evaluator as minimal, precise, consistent with experienced team performance, a phrase that appeared nowhere else in the evaluator's records for this cycle, because experienced team performance was not something that happened in week 1 of RASP, and the evaluator, a retired master sergeant with 22 years of operational experience, had noted it with the faint discomfort of a man who has seen something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. In the 4th room, an op-for role player, a former ranger himself, authorized to be physical, had made a decision to charge Mara directly, calculating that the size differential was significant enough to justify the aggression and that watching a small female candidate respond to a charging male attacker would be instructive for everyone in the room. Her response was a single lateral step to her left, a contact with his forearm that used his forward momentum against him, a controlled rotation that leveraged his own weight through a hip placement she had executed with the muscle memory of something she had done so many times it had become neurological rather than cognitive. A takedown that placed him face down on the mat with his arm at an angle that caused every person watching in the booth above to wince with involuntary sympathy. She held the position for 3 seconds, exactly long enough to simulate a restraint, and then released and moved to the next room without looking back. Hartman sat with the stopwatch in his hand for a long time after the team exited. "Beginner's luck," he said. Torres, standing behind him, had watched the same 11 minutes and 8 seconds. She said, "Yes, Sergeant." That evening, Hartman pulled Mara's enlistment record for the second time and read it with a different quality of attention than he had brought to the first reading. 2 years of community college ROTC. No deployments. No special qualification flags. No prior service awards. The file was thin. Genuinely, unusually thin. The kind of thin that a recruiting NCO would notice and question, and that an experienced intelligence officer would recognize immediately as a constructed absence. Hartman was neither a recruiting NCO nor an intelligence officer. He was a training sergeant with 15 years in training commands, and the concept of a file being strategically thinned was outside his professional vocabulary. He put the file away. He did not sleep as well as usual. The second week introduced night operations, and night operations introduced a dimension of Mara-chan that the daylight evolutions had not fully revealed. The daytime version of her was controlled in a way that, if you were paying attention, had the quality of deliberate restraint rather than natural limitation. A car that is being driven at 40 when its engine is built for 120. She performed consistently in the upper tier without ever appearing to reach the ceiling of her capability, never giving Hartman the obvious excellence that would have been too difficult to explain, never giving him the visible failure that he was engineering conditions to produce. The nighttime version did not have the same constraints. She navigated in darkness with an ease that the other candidates found quietly unsettling, not because it was aggressive or demonstrative, but because it was so plainly natural. She moved through unlighted terrain the way most people move through their own living room, not without caution, but without the careful, deliberate attention of someone who is working to compensate for reduced information. She seemed to gather information from the darkness rather than being impeded by it. The sound of her movement, when she moved, was the absence of sound, not the careful, considered placement of feet that characterized a trained infantry soldier, but the genuine silence of someone who had learned to be quiet in places where the consequences of noise were definitive. Morrison, who moved with the contained power of a large-framed athlete, described it in his later statement as, "She moved like she'd been doing it in the dark since before she learned to do it in daylight. Like darkness wasn't a condition she was operating under. Like darkness was just where she worked." On the third night exercise, a full team patrolling evolution across 20 kilometers of mixed terrain, Mara was assigned as a team member rather than team leader. Hartman had denied her any leadership designation in any exercise, a decision within his technical discretion and motivated entirely by his desire to prevent her from succeeding in a role where success would be unambiguously visible and attributable. If she led a team to success, he could not reframe it. If she performed as a member, there was always an element. The team's assigned leader was Barnes, competent, physically strong, willing, struggling with the specific confidence problem that afflicts leaders who are capable but have not yet had enough successes to trust their own judgment under pressure. For kilometers in, Barnes made a navigation error. The correction required crossing a river that was not on the intended route, and the river in October was the temperature of sustained discomfort, and the crossing took 22 minutes, and it put the team 48 minutes behind schedule with 12 kilometers remaining. Barnes was starting to spiral. Mara could read it in the quality of his movement, the slightly accelerated tempo that wasn't faster because the pace was better, the way his eyes went to the compass every 30 seconds rather than every minute, the micro-expressions of a man recalculating and finding the numbers don't balance. She moved up beside him. "I see an alternate route," she said, voice low enough to be for him only. 200 meters north. Ridgeline parallels our original route. We can cover the remaining distance and come in 8 minutes over without any additional water crossings. Barnes looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I mapped the terrain on the approach. Memorized the contours." "A beat. You memorized the..." "We should move now. The window is tight." Barnes made the decision that, in retrospect, revealed more about his quality as a leader than any of his map reading had. He looked at the woman beside him, weighed what he knew against what he didn't, and said, "Lead." She led them. The ridgeline was where she said it was. The terrain was exactly as she had described it. The team came in 7 minutes and 44 seconds over the scheduled time, within the evaluable margin for a 20-kilometer patrol with a route deviation. Barnes was logged as the team leader and credited with a navigation recovery. Mara's contribution was not noted in Hartman's after-action report. Torres's personal journal for that evening ran to 3 pages. In the third week, the commentary changed in character. It's possible that this was arrogance, the settled certainty of a man who had operated without consequence for long enough that consequence had ceased to feel real. It's possible it was the accumulating confusion of watching Mara perform in ways that didn't fit his framework, and the frustration finding its outlet in escalation. It's possible it was simply what Hartman looked like when the careful management of his behavior began to slip under the weight of his own contempt. The reason is difficult to determine. The conduct itself is documented. Day 17. Formation at 0430. October cold. The kind that gets into joints and reminds them they are not young. 11 candidates in 2 ranks, uniformed correctly, breath visible in the pre-dawn air. Mara in the front row, first position, her uniform immaculate, her expression neutral. Hartman walked the ranks. He stopped in front of her. "Chun," he said. His voice had the quality of someone choosing their volume deliberately, low enough to be for her, loud enough that the 7 candidates within 5 meters could hear every word. "You're still here?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Huh." He considered this for a moment with the performance of a man finding something mildly interesting. "You know what I've been doing for 4 years? Running this program. You know what I've seen in 4 years?" Silence. "I've seen men who trained their whole lives wash out in the first week. Rangers. Marines. Olympic athletes. Men who were born for this and still couldn't make it. You understand what that means." He leaned in. "It means this program isn't about how well you did somewhere else. It's not about what some paper pusher at PERSCOM thinks they're doing, sending." He glanced her up and down with the specific quality of appraisal that is designed to communicate worthlessness, whatever this is. This is a warfighter program, not a diversity showcase, not a social experiment, not a political statement. 7 witnesses. You're too weak for this, sweetheart. Then he used the word. The one that appears in the JAG report as Exhibit A. The one that 8 independent witness statements reproduce in identical verbatim language, because it was the kind of word that lodged in memory and did not move. He used it once, softly, almost conversationally, the way someone mentions the weather when the weather is not surprising. For half a second, perhaps less, the duration of a single frame in a film, something shifted in Mara's eyes. Not pain, not anger. Something colder and more considered, the expression of someone who has added an item to a list and noted the time. "Understood, Sergeant," she said. He moved on. Morrison, standing 2 positions to her right, stared at the back of Hartman's head. His jaw was set. His hands were flat at his sides in the way that hands are flat when the alternative requires conscious management. Park, immediately to her left, reached out and touched her arm briefly with 2 fingers. A small, careful gesture, nothing visible from any distance, a human acknowledgement of an inhuman moment. Mara registered both, filed both. The mental database she had been maintaining now contained 17 days of material. Dates, times, witnesses, exact language, deviation from published Army policy by specific regulation and subparagraph. The documentation was comprehensive enough that a military attorney would have called it a gift. Mara would not have used that word. She would have said, thorough. She had been trained by people who understood that thoroughness, applied patiently, was the only preparation that didn't run out. On day 21, Barnes broke his ankle in the drainage channel, and the story shifted. The tactical obstacle course was the kind of evolution that tested the specific intersection of physical capability, technical skill, and decision-making under cumulative fatigue, a combination that RAS designers had engineered deliberately because it was the intersection that actual operational conditions tested. Candidates ran it in full kit, 45 pounds of body armor, water, ammunition, and equipment. The obstacles included a 12-foot wall assault, a rope bridge traverse over a 10-foot drop into sand, and a 40-meter low crawl through a drainage channel that ran with October water and 2 months of accumulated Georgia mud. Barnes landed badly off the rope bridge. The sound was audible. He went down at the base of the channel entry and did not get up, and the color of his face shifted to the gray-white of a body in significant shock, and his right foot was at an angle that communicated its condition without requiring medical knowledge to interpret. The course evaluator assigned to this section was 30 meters away, responding to a separate equipment issue at the wall obstacle. Hartman, who should have been in the primary safety position at the channel entry, the position designated in the course safety plan, the position he was required to occupy under the training safety regulation he had signed his name to at the beginning of every cycle, was not there. He had stepped away to take a phone call. This would appear in the incident report as temporary absence from designated safety position. It would appear in Captain Weiss's JAG assessment as dereliction of duty contributing to candidate injury. Barnes was lying at the base of a 10-foot drop with a fractured ankle and 45 pounds of kit in a drainage channel that was filling from uphill water flow. The fill rate was not catastrophic, but it was not slow either. The channel was running at mid-shin depth and rising, and Barnes was unable to move himself, and the time between his fall and the evaluator's arrival was a span that Mara, watching from 8 meters back in the queue, calculated with the rapid assessment habit of someone who had calculated similar time intervals in places where the consequences of miscalculation were terminal. She entered the channel at a controlled run. She reached Barnes in 7 seconds. She did a rapid assessment. Ankle fracture, not compound. No visible spinal involvement based on the mechanism of injury. Significant pain response, but airway clear, breathing rapid but present. Moving him carried risk. Not moving him, as the water continued to rise, carried more. She got her arms into position. Barnes was 6 feet 1 inch and 195 pounds. He was wearing 45 pounds of kit. Mara was 5 feet 2 inches and 115 pounds, and was wearing 45 pounds of her own kit. She carried him. What she used was a modification of a fireman's carry she had adapted for low-clearance environments. The original technique was not designed for the constricted vertical space of a drainage channel, and she had developed the modification herself during a training exercise in a different country, for different purposes, several years before. It distributed his weight across her shoulders and the upper back in a manner that minimized load concentration and maximized structural efficiency, and it locked his injured ankle against her torso to prevent the rotational movement that would convert a fracture to a compound fracture. She covered 8 meters to the channel exit in 53 seconds. Morrison, who was behind her in the queue, later described what he saw. I've played with professional athletes. I've trained with NFL players. I've never seen a human being do what she did in that channel. She wasn't straining. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I've seen strong people carry heavy things, and it looks like effort. She looked like she was solving a problem, like it was a puzzle she'd seen before. She set Barnes down at the channel exit with a precision that was, in the assessment of the evaluator who arrived 40 seconds later, inconsistent with emergency transport under duress. It looked practiced. Then she called the medevac. 9-line medevac requests have a specific format: location, frequency, number of patients, special equipment required, patient nationality and status, NBC contamination, marking of pickup site, patient condition, terrain description. The format exists because in emergency conditions, when time is compressed and adrenaline is distorting cognition and the variables are multiplying, the format provides a structure that can be executed even when the mind is struggling. Mara's 9-line report was delivered in flat, complete, unbroken sequence, in a voice that did not vary in pace or pitch from its first word to its last. Every field correct, every measurement accurate, no hesitation. The evaluator, arriving as she finished, took the radio and confirmed the request, and then looked at her for a moment. This small, wet woman in 45 pounds of kit, having just carried a man considerably larger than herself out of a filling drainage channel, reporting it in the voice of someone describing a scheduled meeting. Mara stepped back and let him take over. Torres, who had heard the impact from 20 meters away and arrived in time to see the final portion of the carry and the entirety of the 9-line report, was already reaching for her personal radio. Not to call additional help. Barnes had all the help that was available. She was calling a different number. A number she had been given at the beginning of this assignment by a man in a Pentagon office with the instruction, "You'll know when." She knew. "It's done," she said, when the line connected. We have what we need. Incident today qualifies as gross negligence under the applicable standard. Requesting activation of Phase 2. There was a brief pause, 2-3 seconds, and then the voice on the other end said, Phase 2 is active. Orders will reach the training command by 1800 tomorrow. Torres clicked off the radio. She crossed to where Mara was standing. Already stepped back, invisible again, just a wet candidate watching the medevac team work, and stood beside her. Major, Torres said. The word was barely a breath. Not yet, Mara said, at the same volume. Barnes first. He's going to be fine. Fracture, no complications. I know, but he should still come first. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, ma'am. They stood together and watched Barnes get loaded onto the litter, and Mara's expression, across those several minutes, was exactly what it had been for 21 days. Present and calm and unreadable, and something underneath the unreadability that was not quite anything a person could name from the outside. The call Torres made went to a direct line maintained by the office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it was answered on the second ring. And this is the point in the narrative where the machinery behind the surface events requires explanation. Torres had been selected 6 months before Cycle 47 began as a cooperating source in a Pentagon-level investigation into systemic misconduct in Army Special Operations training programs. The investigation had been initiated by a cluster of medical discharges from the previous 2 RAST cycles. 5 candidates who had left the program with injury profiles inconsistent with published training intensity, and who had, in their exit interviews, described conditions that diverged significantly from the official course record. And by 1 death. A candidate named Specialist Alvarez, who had washed out under Hartman's management 7 months earlier and died by suicide 11 weeks after his separation. The medical examiner's report. The chain of documented events. The timing. It had arrived on desks in Washington in a configuration that made quiet burial politically costly. General Howard Blackwood, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had authorized a covert assessment with the specific intent of documenting Hartman's conduct in a manner that could survive legal challenge. And he had chosen the assessment officer with a care that his aide, who had been with him for 11 years and had seen a great deal, described later as the most thorough selection process I've seen him apply to anything. Major Mara Chun had first come to Blackwood's attention when she was 19 years old, and he was commanding a division in Afghanistan, and an element she was attached to, an element whose existence he was not officially aware of and whose designation he could not use in any unclassified context, had successfully extracted 3 American prisoners of war from a situation that 2 prior rescue attempts had failed to resolve, and that the intelligence community had assessed as likely unresolvable without unacceptable loss. He had read the after-action report with the sense that a document had revealed something he couldn't integrate into his existing framework. Then he'd learned her age, and had put the report down, and had sat with it for a while. He had watched her record for 7 years after that. It had continued to be, by any reasonable metric, impossible. She had completed the Special Forces qualification course at 21, finishing in the top 2% of her class. The first woman to complete the full course in its combat arms configuration, a distinction that appeared in a classified annex to the course records rather than in any public documentation. She had served 2 tours in a direct action unit operating under authorities that placed the relevant documentation above the clearance level of most general officers. She had been awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony attended by 12 people, 7 of whom were bound by classification restrictions that prevented them from discussing any aspect of what they had witnessed. The unclassified portion of her citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty, in a time and location that remained classified under national security protocols." She was 26 years old. She held the rank of major. She had more operational experience than most colonels, and a record so thoroughly classified that a routine personnel file check would return something that looked like a 24-year-old with no meaningful service history. She had agreed to the RASP assignment after reading Alvarez's file. "Give me 30 days, she had told Blackwood, in the meeting in which he had briefed her. "I'll have everything you need." He had given her 31. She had used every one of them. Hartman did not sleep on the night of day 21. This was unusual in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him, because he was, as a rule, a man whose sleep was untroubled by reflection, who had developed, over 38 years and 15 years of service and 4 years of running the most feared selection course in the Army Training Command, a remarkable capacity to put the day away at the end of the day and close the door. This capacity was not quite the same thing as a clear conscience. It was more like a very well-organized filing system that kept certain categories of document in a room he didn't open. On this night, something was trying to get out of the room. He pulled Mara's file for the third time. Read it as he'd read it before. Thin, unremarkable, community college ROTC, no special history. Searched her name on the Army personnel system, on Google, on 3 military community forums he was registered on under a username that was not his own. Nothing. No results. No trace. He understood, at some level he couldn't fully articulate, that no trace was itself a category of information. Careful people had small traces. People with nothing to find had moderate traces. People with no trace at all were a different category, and the name for that category was not careful. He sat with this for a long time. At 0700 the next morning, he ran formation as usual, and Mara was in the front row as usual, and he walked to her position as he had walked to her position for 22 mornings. He looked at her. For the first time in his professional memory, he felt, faintly and briefly and immediately suppressed, uncertain. "Chun," he said. "Yes, Sergeant. How'd you get Barnes out of that channel?" The question surprised her, not the substance of it, but the directness, the fact of it being asked in formation, in front of 9 remaining candidates, as if he needed an answer badly enough to ask for it where people could hear him asking. "He was in danger, Sergeant," she said. "That's not what I asked. Adrenaline assists with load-bearing, Sergeant. Adrenaline." He repeated the word. "Right." He moved on, and Morrison, watching Hartman's face as he walked away, saw the expression of a man performing certainty while experiencing something else entirely, and filed it. The orders arrived at 1748. The orders came in a sealed envelope with a classification marking that stopped Hartman's adjutant mid-stride. Not confidential. Not secret. The stamp that lives above secret, the one that the adjutant, a master sergeant with 15 years of administrative service who had processed tens of thousands of documents, had seen perhaps twice in his career, and on both occasions the envelope had been for someone significantly more senior than a training sergeant in a selection program. The adjutant set the envelope on Hartman's desk, left the office, closed the door behind him. Hartman opened it. He read it once, quickly, with the forward momentum of a man accustomed to processing directives. Then he stopped, went back to the beginning. Read it again, slowly, with the quality of attention that people bring to things they are reading correctly but hoping, against the evidence of the words, that they are somehow misreading. He put it down. He sat completely still. 90 seconds. The longest stillness, in the experience of his adjutant, who was listening, from outside the closed door, with the acute attention of someone who has learned that unusual stillness from certain people means unusual things are occurring, that Hartman had demonstrated since a lower back injury 3 years ago had briefly removed him from the ability to move under his own power. The orders were written in the formal, clear, declarative language of official military directives. They notified him that Ranger Assessment and Selection Program Cycle 47 was under active review by authority of the Office of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that a covert assessment officer, operating undercover authority granted at the JSOC level, had been embedded in Cycle 47 from day one, that this officer had been collecting documentation relevant to an ongoing Inspector General and Judge Advocate General investigation into training misconduct, harassment, gross negligence in training safety, and conduct contributing to candidate injury and prior candidate death. That the officer's cover was effective receipt of these orders, terminated. That recruit Private Chun, Mara L., was to be recognized immediately by her actual rank and position. Major, United States Army, Joint Special Operations Command. That Hartman was to render all applicable military courtesies accordingly. That Captain Lisa Weiss, JAG Corps, would report to the training command at 0800 the following morning to initiate formal proceedings. That Hartman was relieved of his position as RASP training officer effective immediately, pending the outcome of said proceedings, and should consider himself on administrative hold. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the final page, above a signature that Hartman recognized, because it was one of the most recognizable signatures in the American military, because he had seen it on the training command's authorization paperwork and on the photographs that hung in his commanding officer's conference room, and, once, on a commendation he'd received 9 years ago for a training achievement that now felt very distant. General Howard Blackwood, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had written 8 sentences in a handwriting that was spare and deliberate. Sergeant Hartman. She volunteered for this assignment. She read Alvarez's file, and she asked to go. She asked for 30 days. I gave her 31. She documented everything. You had the same 31 days to demonstrate that the complaints were wrong. I'm sorry we couldn't be more surprised. Hartman sat in his office until 2100. The building quieted around him. The lights in the administrative hallway went to standby. His coffee cooled, and then became cold and remained untouched. At 2100, he put on his cover and walked to the barracks. He did not sleep. Morning formation. 0600, day 22. The 9 remaining candidates stood in formation on the parade ground. October sky, clear and very blue, the kind that looks like something from before the modern era. The tree-line at the edge of the field was fully turned, orange and red and brown, precise and vivid in the early light. Behind the candidates, in a positioning that was unusual enough to produce sideways glances, but not unusual enough to break formation discipline, Captain Weiss in Jag Brassard, Torres in full-dress uniform. 2 men in civilian clothes who carried themselves with the specific quality of stillness that marks people who have spent time in places where visible alertness was a liability. Hartman arrived at 0600 exactly. His uniform was correct. His cover was on straight. His face was the face of a man who had made a calculation about what the next 10 minutes required of him and had decided to perform it correctly even though the performance would cost him something he did not have words for. He stood at the front of the formation. He faced the 2 ranks. He looked at Mara. She was in the front row, first position, the position she had occupied every morning for 22 mornings. Her uniform was immaculate, as it had always been. Her beret was centered at the regulation angle. She stood at ease with her hands clasped at the small of her back, and her expression was the expression she had worn for 22 days. Present, calm, the surface of a lake that was very deep and very still. She looked, if you knew how to read it, exactly like what she was. He had not known how to read it. He did now. Hartman turned to the formation. His voice, when he used it, was quieter than his usual register. No parade ground projection, no volume deployed as a tool of authority. Fall out, he said. The formation broke. 9 candidates found reasons to drift to the edges of the parade ground rather than the barracks, because they understood, in the way that people understand things before they can fully articulate them, that they were about to witness something. Hartman turned back to Mara. She had not moved. She stood where she had stood for 22 mornings. He looked at her for a moment that had its own specific quality, not long enough to be dramatic, not short enough to be easy. The moment of a man standing at the edge of something that cannot be walked back from once he crosses it, and knowing it, and crossing it anyway. Major Chun, he said. The words came out exactly as he had rehearsed them. He had rehearsed them, in the silent office, in the sleepless hours. He had known they were coming. He had practiced until they were flat and correct, and gave away nothing that he could prevent them from giving away. Mara came to attention, and then Staff Sergeant Wade Hartman raised his right hand and rendered a full, correct, regulation salute to the woman he had spent 22 days attempting to destroy. His hand was steady. This surprised him, mildly, because he had not been certain it would be. Mara returned the salute, crisply, with the timing and angle specified in FM 7-21. 13. The Army Field Manual on Drill and Ceremony that she had studied as a West Point plebe and internalized as thoroughly as she'd internalized everything else. She returned it and held it for a beat. 1 beat longer than the minimum, not to extend his discomfort, not to underline anything, but because holding a salute for its proper duration was correct, and she was a person who did things correctly. At ease, Sergeant, she said. He lowered his hand. Around the perimeter of the parade ground, the 9 candidates were very still. Morrison was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set. His eyes were wet, which confused him when he noticed it. He had not expected to feel anything, or had expected to feel something simple, something that fit a simple name. What he felt was not simple. It was the feeling that arrives when the world briefly aligns with how it ought to be, and the feeling is so unfamiliar that the body doesn't know what category to file it under and defaults, awkwardly, to the physical vocabulary of grief. Park was standing very straight. The posture of someone who has been taught that standing straight is a form of respect, and who is paying the maximum available respect to what they are witnessing. Diaz had his arms crossed and was nodding slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he had suspected for a long time. Torres stood beside Captain Weiss and watched. Torres was not a sentimental person. The Army had provided extensive training in the management of sentiment over 20 years, and she had been an apt student. But she had been watching this moment approach for 22 days, and the arrival of something you have been watching approach has its own category of feeling, distinct from surprise, and simpler than joy. Behind them, the two men in civilian clothes were already on their phones. What followed is documented across 3 government reports, 2 JAG proceedings, and 1 carefully worded Army Times article whose subject is never named, but whose details are specific enough that several people in the special operations community read it and knew. The formal proceedings against Hartman lasted 11 weeks. Captain Weiss brought charges that included violations of Army Equal Opportunity Regulation, dereliction of duty in connection with the Barnes injury incident, conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer, and, most significantly, a pattern of conduct that the JAG investigation, aided by Torres's journal and Mara's mental documentation and the independent statements of 8 witnesses to the Day 17 incident, successfully linked to 4 prior cases, including 2 medical discharges, and the circumstances surrounding Alvarez's death. Hartman was reduced in rank to sergeant, separation with a general discharge under honorable conditions. Captain Weiss, in the conclusion of her final report, a section that was unusual in its length and directness, wrote, "The outcome of these proceedings, while representing the maximum achievable result under current evidentiary constraints, does not adequately reflect the severity or the duration of the conduct documented. The limitations are systemic rather than case-specific and represent a finding that goes beyond this proceeding." She filed the report. She signed it. It went into the record. Barnes had surgery on the fractured ankle. The surgery was successful. He spent 12 weeks in physical rehabilitation with the focused determination of a man who has been rescued by someone and does not intend to have that investment go to waste. He re-entered the RASP pipeline the following spring and graduated in the top third of his cycle. At his graduation, he gave a brief speech that his classmates and instructors described as unexpectedly moving. He said, in part, "I want to thank someone whose name I'm not able to use in this context. Someone who taught me, by example, that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the integrity to recognize who does and the courage to follow them." Several people in the audience understood exactly who he meant. Park completed the cycle. He graduated and was assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment, where he served 4 years before being selected for Special Forces Assessment and Selection. On the day he received his selection notification, he sent a text message to a number he had memorized rather than stored. He'd been told to memorize it. With a brief note, "I remembered the terrain reading. Thank you for those 20 minutes. The reply came 11 days later, from an unspecified location, in a message whose brevity was characteristic. "Well done, Park. Keep going." Morrison was selected, to his own considerable surprise, for an Army officer candidate school nomination at the end of his Ranger service. He had not considered himself officer material before RASP. He was less certain, after RASP, that he understood what officer material looked like, or rather, he had discovered that his previous definition had been missing some important variables. He commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant and was assigned to an infantry battalion. He was a good officer, by most subsequent accounts, specifically noted for the clarity of his instructions under pressure and his habit of paying close, unglamorous attention to the people around him. Torres was promoted to Master Sergeant the following year. Her personal journal, entered into evidence as a JAG exhibit, was described by Captain Weiss in a personal communication as among the most thorough and useful contemporaneous documentation I have encountered in 17 years of military law practice. Torres received the commendation matter-of-factly, in the way she received most things. In the spring following the investigation, the Army published updated training standards for all Special Operations Selection programs. The standards addressed equal opportunity enforcement, safety officer positioning requirements, candidate documentation procedures, and the specific conduct provisions that had allowed Hartman's pattern to persist across multiple cycles and multiple commands. The standards were developed by a working group whose membership is partially classified, but which includes, in a footnote to the published doctrine update, input from subject matter experts from JSOC operational and training elements. The standards are referred to informally, in the training community, by the instructors who implement them and the candidates who train under them, as the Chun standards. Nobody in the training community knows why. The name comes from nowhere documented. It arrived the way certain things arrive in institutions, sideways, through informal channels, from people who were there and cannot say exactly what they saw, but have named it anyway. There is a photograph on the wall of General Howard Blackwood's Pentagon office. Visitors passing through for the routine business of senior military administration often glance at it and assume it is a standard unit photo, the kind of group record image that populates the walls of every senior officer's workspace, photographs that say, "These are the things I was part of, the people I served with, the accumulations of a career." Look more closely and it resists easy categorization. 12 people. Field dress, not dress uniform. A location that could be several places. The coloration suggests desert or near desert, the kind of light that falls in mid-morning at altitude in the southern hemisphere or the Middle East or any of several other places that don't appear on the itineraries of people who travel for conventional purposes. The background is partially obscured. No unit identifiers. No insignia that would settle the question of who these people are or what they were doing in the place where this was taken. In the front row, left position, there is a woman who might be 5'2". She is not smiling. None of them are smiling. Field conditions and the specific kind of exhaustion that follows certain kinds of work do not generally produce smiles. And these people have clearly been in the field for long enough that the field has become something they live inside rather than something they visit. She is looking at the camera with an expression that is, if you have encountered it, familiar, calm, unreadable, the quality of a very still surface above significant depth. She is the youngest person in the photograph by approximately 6 years. She is holding a rifle in the grip of someone for whom the rifle is not equipment. It is more like an extension. The grip is automatic, unconsidered, the way experienced drivers hold a wheel, present without thought, correct without correction. There is nothing in the photograph that identifies her. No caption below it. No label on the back, in the unlikely event that a visitor would think to check. Blackwood, when asked about the photograph, says, "Unit photo," which is true, in the way that certain true statements contain more than they reveal. What he does not say, because the people in this photograph exist in operational spaces where the practice of saying things about them carries specific and known consequences, is that the photograph was taken approximately 12 hours after the conclusion of an operation that, were it to be declassified in the next several decades, would occupy a chapter in the professional histories of the relevant commands, and likely a congressional hearing, and almost certainly a film that would get most of the significant details wrong. He does not say that the woman in the front left was 23 years old when this was taken. He does not say that the operation it followed was planned by her. He does not say that she had, at that point, been doing this, some version of this, for 4 years, and that the expression on her face is the expression of someone for whom this particular category of hard thing had become, through sustained and costly practice, the most natural state of being available. He keeps the photograph on the wall where he can see it from his desk. In meetings that are difficult in the particular way that meetings with powerful people who are certain of certain things tend to be difficult, he sometimes glances at it. Not often, just sometimes. It's enough.